Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, and thank you for joining our webinar today, How to Really See Insider Threats. Today, Maurizio Renzi and Chris Puderbaugh will run an explanation of how to do an insider threat program from top to bottom. Maurizio is our Senior Director of Sales Engineering, and Chris Puderbaugh is also in our Sales Engineering team here at Red Owl. Between the two of them, they've seen many insider threat programs and can share best practices with you today. With that, let's turn it over to Maurizio to begin our presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Rob, and thanks to everyone for joining us here today. I'm going to walk through, as Rob mentioned, an overview of how we see first key trends shaping the insider threat space, especially among our customers and throughout the market as a whole. Then we're going to provide some best practices and recommendations for how we have seen and helped customers stand up really comprehensive, holistic programs within their enterprise. And Chris will take you through some details and technical details on what specifically we recommend, the approaches that we often take when it comes to detecting, identifying, and responding to the insider threat. So first, I'll start with some key trends in the enterprise that we have noticed that really impact the insider threat. And some of these are a little bit seemingly tangential, right? So, but what we are seeing is when you connect the dots, all of these really help kind of build out the attack surface and the nature of the threat. First trend is unstructured data continues to explode in the organization. And here is just a kind of a visual representation of that. But what we're noticing is that the growth in unstructured file-based data storage is outpacing the growth in structured data. So organizations are retaining and keeping more and more information for longer periods of time. And within that information, what you find are, essentially the crown jewels of your organization: intellectual property, sensitive data, et cetera. These numbers are pretty big, right? This is in terms of exabytes. And in fact, so big that this chart doesn't really do it justice. But if you were to take all the tape storage, going back to tape that contains the data that you have represented on this chart, it would, if you unfurled that tape, it'd reach from the Earth to the Sun, over 100 million miles worth of tape. So there's obviously a lot of data. What are the implications of all of this unstructured data, right? Unstructured data really represents an organization's lifeblood. This is digitized, it is high value information. Think of manufacturing plans, financial statements, source code, et cetera. What we've seen from our customers as we've taken them on this journey, the insider threat, is that a focus on logs and metadata analysis, which is really how cybersecurity has developed over the years, right? Looking at log data, looking at metadata. But what that's left is these troves of unstructured data untouched. And when we talk about unstructured data, what are we talking about specifically? We're referring to content. So the content in attachments and files, web searches, social media posts. So there's a lot of unstructured content that goes unseen within the enterprise. And secondly, communications, email, corporate chat, and once again, social media. So how are people communicating with one another? We're even seeing this extend into transcribed voice data, for instance, text messages, et cetera. The problem is organizations are not drawing sort of key behavioral insights from this unstructured data. When you look at unstructured data, you want to look at data movement, right? How do you identify at-risk, sensitive data moving both within and without your organization? Right. Secondly is employee sentiment. When you start to look at communications, you want to begin to find ways to infer motivations and precursors to negative action. So these are some of the key insights that are locked away in that unstructured data. Secondly, and this is something that we see everywhere, especially with larger organizations, but there are legacy apps that are just not going away. And as much as we want to, transition to modern infrastructures and modern technologies, 50% of applications within a typical enterprise is still legacy. And so how are our customers, how are people monitoring and protecting that data? So between unstructured data, legacy applications, what you're seeing is, there are blind spots inside the organization. And a third trend as we talk about what is really feeding into the insider threat problem is black markets, external actors that are enticing, encouraging, and colluding with your insiders to take action, to cause harm against your company. So the folks that internally are maybe financially motivated or idealistically motivated have a support system in place, and that support system just continues to grow, right? And they have their own social media, they have their own communications networks that make it easy to conduct internal espionage. So these things come together in a very interesting way when we talk about insider threat. And the things that we have to acknowledge is, number one, we refer to human digital exhaust, right? What is the trail that the people inside of your organization leave behind? And it continues to grow, right? And so security needs to broaden their focus. You need to broaden your perspective to start to think about some of these non-traditional data sources, go beyond firewalls, intrusion detection systems, web application firewalls, et cetera. The attack surface, as an extension of that, the attack surface continues to expand. So electronic communications, social media, cloud storage, endpoints, these legacy apps, these are all potential channels of abuse. And finally, agility is a must, right? You've got to be able to start to develop an agile platform to handle all these various data structures, whether structured data, unstructured data, and really build these strategies into your insider threat analytic models and platforms. When you look at all of this, of course, it should come as no surprise that insider threats really most common cause of breach in 2015. So when you look at all the different kinds of threats that are impacting an organization, internal incidents represent a huge chunk of that. And it's not all just malicious intent, right? It's negligence. It's internally compromised users. So there is a huge problem with incidents that are originating inside of your four walls, and it's only growing, right? And so when you think of the insider threat, some things to keep in mind. People are at the end of the day, you think of social engineering, you think of malware, spear phishing, and your people become your biggest attack surface. It's the person that clicks on that attachment or clicks on that link that exposes you to this risk. Threats. We're seeing that the organizations that we're working with, whether it's dedicated insider threat teams, SOC teams, compliance teams, they're having to expand their focus from what's happening outside of their world to what is originating internally. One of the things that we've seen, and we think that this is something that ultimately has to change, is organizations treating this as an extension of their network security, their network security platform, rather than what it really is, which is a behavior human risk problem. So the same tools and techniques that you're using to tackle network security doesn't necessarily apply here. And ultimately, really tackling insider threat is going to require a different method. And we'll talk more about that in a bit when we start getting into recommendations and best practices. I touched on this a moment ago, but insider threat takes many forms. While humans, people are the common denominators, they can be folks that are extraordinarily disgruntled, right? The IT administrator who just found out he's not getting a promotion, right? And then intends to cause harm to the network before departing the company. We have, say, an unknowing accountant compromised, downloads a spreadsheet with malware and starts leaking client data. We've got external actors, so greedy, contractors or even interns that are spending time, within your enterprise for a summer. And collecting data and then exfiltrating that data from your organization, and the list goes on, right? Individuals who are blackmailed, internal activists, careless managers who are negligent and are not taking care and practice in protecting the corporate secrets, for instance. So insider threat takes a variety of forms. And so it's an interesting and challenging problem to have to tackle, right? So you're talking about different motivations, different subtleties that distinguish a compromised user from a malicious actor, et cetera. And finally, how are folks tackling this today? And so it's very interesting because, first of all, SANS did a survey last year. And in this survey, 3/4 of the respondents in the survey said that they are very worried about the insider threat. And yet of that population, 32% indicated they have no measures in place today to actually account for this problem. So a lot of organizations are essentially ignoring it or just overwhelmed and not taking action. The ones that are, and this is something we've seen, have turned to tried and true network security tools and techniques. They're relying on signatures, static policies. They're taking what's worked for firewalls for decades and intrusion detection systems and trying to apply it to behavior. And that's not working. We see these disjointed approaches to the insider threat. Insider threat is something that spans a variety of parts of your organizations. It requires close coordination between HR, physical security, network security, et cetera. And we see that these organizations are not operating in sync, and that becomes problematic. Now, one thing we've seen, and we'll talk about this, is reliance on trained network security professionals to evaluate these signals of inside risk. Right, someone who's a CISSP and understands how malware works and understands how distributed denial of service attacks work. Are not necessarily the kinds of folks that are trained or well equipped to understand what is motivating a potential bad actor inside your network. And finally, we touched on this earlier, incomplete pictures of human risk. Unstructured data, communications, content, these things go untouched, and you need these sources of data to identify these signs of inside risk. So we'll transition into what we see in terms of what it takes to really build out an insider threat program, what's required. But once you've done that, and you look down 12 months down the road, 9 months down the road, whatever it might be, and you step back, what we've seen that the things that sort of that are in common across successful programs are what you see here. So first of all, a successful insider threat program is going to create a culture of compliance. Openness about oversight, a real dedication to doing it in a responsible way, right? Where you're factoring in privacy and those kinds of and those kinds of very serious issues, and then continuous reinforcement of the policies that you have in place have a positive effect on compliance and a positive effect on how people behave inside your network. So a good insider threat program is going to create a culture of compliance. Secondly, a good insider threat program is going to tailor the evaluation of risk. So it's all about calculating risk and understanding risk. And it's going to tailor that to factor in motivation. So these are people. These are not machines or programs or malware that have been programmed to carry out a task. These are people that have different kinds of motivations. And so you have to identify ways to capture sentiment, to capture behavioral risk indicators that you can layer in with your network activity, with user activity inside of the enterprise. Good insider threat programs achieve organizational alignment. And we have seen this in the past where we've had conversations with the folks and they haven't had buy-in from all these different organizations. And inevitably, after a month of brainstorming and looking for and coming up with great ideas, a program is stalled because you don't have full buy-in from the C-suite, from human resources, from physical security, legal, information security, privacy, data owners. So you have to have all these different groups aligned to really press forward with an insider threat program and to do it right. And the final point here, and this is something that Chris Puderbaugh is going to jump into in a bit, but an insider threat program focuses on high-risk people and high-value assets. Generally speaking, and this is kind of the risk calculation that you have to make, is you can't always apply the same level of analysis against every single person in the organization. So it's important to identify where your crown jewels are, to identify which assets are most important, whether those are digital assets or physical assets or even human assets, and then to identify those groups that are most at risk, right? So this is just sort of basic stuff, but this is how you start to tackle the problem and to do it well. And finally, and then I'll throw it over to Chris, who is really one of our key subject matter experts in this space. But when we talk about the foundation of an effective insider threat program, we really talk about three things, right? It starts with the team. No technology. Red Owl is a technology company, but no technology is going to help you tackle this problem if you don't have the right team in place. We are strong believers in the fact that you need a dedicated insider threat function. You need a dedicated insider threat analyst who has an emphasis, and has a skill set on behavioral issues, on sentiment, on the things that motivate internal actors to do bad things or to be compromised. And so to do that, you've got to have a dedicated specialized analyst or analyst team. And especially because, what we're talking about here is employees or contractors. We're talking about real people. And so generally it's not a function that is going to be a team of 25, 30. Most organizations that we work with have very small teams. It might be one person, it might be 5 people, but small teams of very skilled analysts who focus on this and are sensitive to the nature of the problem, right? Because this is sensitive data. You're looking at potentially communications data and that sort of thing. So you have to have insider threat analysts that are really dedicated to this effort. And finally, these are folks that ultimately have to make judgments on inside risk. So you have to have trust in them. Secondly, is processes. Bringing issues to the forefront is one thing. Identifying suspicious behavior is one thing, but then being able to take action, especially, again, we're talking about real people, we're talking about employees, we're talking about the people that might work down the hall from you. Operationalizing the insider threat function is critical, and knowing how you do it. The first thing that we talk about is audit trails are the most important thing. So you have to audit everything that's done. You have to have an audit trail. You have to be able to go back and if you get to the point where you have to take some kind of disciplinary action, you have to show basically the rationale. You've got to show the breadcrumbs. You have to show the work that was done. So audit is critical in truly operationalizing this function. Secondly is maintaining tight controls. It's really, you have to control access to the data that analysts are looking at. You have to have very granular entitlements to that data. If you're looking at communications data coupled with network data, you've got to be able to, in a really granular fashion, carve that up so that folks are seeing what they absolutely have to see, right? It's kind of the whole philosophy, principles of least privilege, right? Roles-based access, obviously. And then finally, it's measured policy-driven response. You have to have very well-documented, well-defined response paths that inform somebody as to whether this is an issue for HR, right? Is it, are we seeing signs of potential workplace violence? Someone using maybe an unusual increase in threatening language against some of their peers, things of that nature. So, is this something that is an HR issue? Is this something that is an information security issue? Is it something that's a physical security issue? So you've got to have very well-defined response criteria in place. And finally, technology. And this is what we will, again, we're a technology company, and this is kind of what we know best. But from a technology perspective, you've got to be focused on full spectrum analysis. And that's not just looking at, proxy logs. It's not just looking at authentication events. It's looking at sentiment. It's looking at, communications. It's looking at content. It's one thing to see that there's a print job that happened at 11 o'clock at night, but it's another to see what the contents of that print job were, right? Is it sensitive data? And finally, non-technical indicators. So, you've got to leverage user activity with what we know about the users. And sometimes this entails org chart data, HR data, what have you. But those are the things that really help inform an analytical approach here. So that's the technology aspect, and it comes down to user behavior modeling. Happy, satisfied employees don't usually do bad things, right? They're happy with where they are. They're doing well. They're making money, and generally speaking, right? So you've got to look at behavior. you've got to give your analyst deep dive forensics, the ability to really perform ad hoc investigations and to dig deep into the data and sort of apply their human analytical craft to this problem, in addition to analytics, in addition to automated analytics. And finally, we started this by mentioning this, but technology is only effective if you have the basics in place: policies, controls, training. So really, that fundamentally speaking, you've got to think about those things. Otherwise, technology is not going to get you very far. So those are kind of the three elements of an effective insider threat program that we have seen and that we have talked about with our customers. And I think now we're going to sort of deep dive a bit more into building out an effective insider threat program and kind of what that means in a little bit more detail. So with that, I'll throw it over to Chris Puderball.
Thank you, Mauricio. So when starting insider threat program, if you look at some of the latest mandates that have come out, such as NISPOM, really the only requirement is to stand up the insider threat program. But beyond that, there are little to no details as to what that involves. So what's the first step? The first step is identifying what matters to you and your company. And that varies based off of the type of the company. So if you think of like a company like Red Owl, our source code matters most to us. If it's the government, it's classified documents, other sensitive information. Healthcare, it's PII, things related to HIPAA. Beyond that, the next step is, where are my risks? So I know what I care about. What is a threat to those things that I care about? Is it a group of people? Is it an external threat? Is it a certain type of incident? So understanding what those potential risks are is the next best step. And then when you start talking about insider threat analytics, it all ties back to the data. What data do I have? A lot of times we'll have people ask us, what can I do with your product? We often have to turn the tables on them and say, well, what data can you give to us? Because that then fuels the different use cases that we can provide. Without the data, we're no good. So data varies across vendors and even data domains. If you think about something like authentication, what is authentication? It's you logging on to a Windows workstation. It's you logging on to your Linux terminal. It's even you logging on to a certain proprietary web application. Each of those different types and vendors generate different data, different fields, different values. So standardizing that data is the first challenge. Without standardizing it, what you're stuck with is asking one analytic question numerous times. So show me risk for authentication. If I have 3 different silos of authentication, I then have to ask it by each silo. So what you want to do is use a common model that you can map these different data sources to then allow you to ask a question at the high level and have it apply to all those different data sources. Within that model, you need a concept of entities and attributes. So if you think about the number of things that you care about in your network, what is a thing? A thing is, it's a person, it's a computer, it's a USB stick, it's a printer, it can even be a web domain. The things are what you're grading risk by. So you want to see a risk for these things. But you get more information within events. So if it's not an entity, it's an attribute. And an attribute is an enhancement of the event. So for this thing, I also noticed that this parameter was present in the event. And a good example of this would be a cloud storage event from this person, and it was, or he or she uploaded this amount of bytes, and the bytes would be the attribute. The information model also needs to be able to account for unstructured and structured data. So structured data is the easy part, right? It's consistent, it's expected values, it's easy to build schemas off of. But unstructured provides a ton of value, but it's harder to get a grip on. From unstructured, there's a whole different realm of use cases that come from that, such as sentiment, even when you think about like confidential project words that might exist in communications, and so on. So once the data is organized in a manner that's going to provide the most efficient analytics, you need to think about how you're going to provide those analytics. The common scenario I usually mention to people is if you have this very powerful analytic tool, it's almost like a Google search bar for all your company data, and your boss then presents the challenge to you, okay, go find insider threats within our environment. Where do you start? If you have the search bar where you can ask any question, what do you do? And that's really, I think, where some other analytic platforms struggle, because they have this open-ended capability and it's not tailored to a specific use case. So these models ideally need to be baked into the analytic solution that allow you to pipe data into them and then tweak them at a high level to produce risk output. These models also need to leverage employee attributes. So if you think about a government SF-86 data, document, the amount of employee data in there, all that should not be accessible to the analytic platform. There's a lot of good attribute data in there, such as financial history, criminal history, addresses, and whatnot. And what that does for you is it enhances each event or incident that occurs. So it's no longer this person uploaded a confidential file. It's this person is in severe debt and struggling financially, and they've uploaded confidential files. So it paints a bigger picture for the entire scenario. And you also provide the option at starting with the employee data. So going back to that Google search bar of your company data example, if you take the common approach, which is I'm looking for anomalies in the machine data generated by user activity. A more effective approach might be starting with a user and say, okay, let's see all activity for my employees who are struggling financially. So it's a better starting point and can lead to more efficient analytics. These models also need to be able to develop true statistical baselines. A lot of different solutions provide the capabilities to develop baselines, but they need to often tie back to the ability to be able to normalize an employee's data and activity over time. So in terms of analytic structure, what's the best approach for this? To start out, let's think about an insider threat incident. What is an incident? What goes into an incident? Is it one event, one malicious event? Is it multiple events rolled into a single behavior? Or is it multiple behaviors involved in a scenario? It's probably multiple behaviors because you're doing different things within the network and within your communications that all roll into an overarching scenario. And that's the most efficient approach. So I can have multiple different types of data, different types of events that roll into a single behavior. And then these behaviors can then be bundled into scenarios such as data exfiltration, malicious user, compromised account, and so on. So what I'm getting away from is very specific signatures, which when you think about the classic security analytics, it's I care about when this happens, and then this, and then this. The problem is that signature might match for like once a year. The match might be very useful and very effective, but it's not going to be broad enough to collect the amount of data on employees that you want. And just to give an example of this approach to the analytics, let's look at something like data exfiltration. So let's say you have a disgruntled employee. Within his communications, you can see he has some negative sentiment. He's not happy. He's upset. So that's not only one behavior, but it's one data type and one type of event. Also, he's searching and gathering data, and that's a different type of data source again, but it then rolls into a different behavior. So before it might have been negative sentiment. Now it's, reconnaissance, trying to find the information he wants to exfil. And then next, he's uploading the cloud storage. So again, a different data source and a completely different type of behavior. It's the actual exfiltration part. It's not the sentiment, and it's not the reconnaissance. And then moving on, maybe he's doing something like searching, how do I delete my bash history? So he's doing research to cover his tracks. And then he could end up finishing with the deletion of his bash history. So multiple different types of data, multiple events certainly, and also multiple behaviors that factor into a single scenario.
Thanks, Chris. And so the three things that Chris described, at a high level, have been the driving philosophies behind the technology and the solution that Red Owl has built. So we'll spend a couple of minutes walking you through that, and really how we're helping our customers and organizations meet the insider threat challenges that we started out by discussing. Okay, from a perspective of kind of an overarching solution, overarching approach, we really think that to get to a more proactive stance on identifying, on being able to predict bad behavior, on being able to take action quickly, you've got to be able to consume a wide range, the full gamut of activity, from machine metadata, which is your network activity, endpoint data, human metadata, which is what we know about actors within the enterprise. What do we know about their identity? And then you have to layer on top of that human content and context. So communications data, which we've talked about a bit, and then enrichment data, which Chris touched on, and is incredibly valuable when you pull in some of these additional enrichment feeds that help you better assess risk within the organization. So this is just really, from our perspective, this describes the kind of the universe of capabilities that we think are required to reach this proactive state where you can deal with both unstructured and structured data sources. Our mission as a company is to identify folks that are showing specific patterns of risk. Patterns of risk, by the way, and again, Chris touched on this, patterns of risk that might be different from one customer to the next, from one industry to the next. So that whole idea of flexibility and agility are crucial here when you're talking about what is a pattern of risk. But when we look at that, these patterns are characterized by the actions people take, and they're made relevant by the personal attributes that identify those insiders. So everything we do, everything that a good technology insider threat solution should do, is to help provide a deeper understanding of who your insiders are, what you know about them, what additional insights can you glean about them, what do they say and do within the organization, with whom do they interact, and with what do they interact. So kind of this idea of are there patterns of collusion, are there patterns of compromise that extend to a circle of actors. How and when do they act? Is this a normal time of day? Is this a normal day of week for someone to take a certain kind of action? What content is involved in their actions? Data movement, we talked about that earlier. And then finally, how do these actions compare to themselves? How do they compare to their peers? So these are some of the questions that you need to be able to answer to give your insider threat analysts enough insight, enough context to take action. Red Owl, really, there are two, at a high level, there are two verticals or two industries that we target, regulatory surveillance and information security. Regulatory surveillance, there are, SEC has all sorts of regulations that mandate monitoring and surveillance of traders, regulated traders, looking for signs of front running, improper disclosure, trading on material non-public information, wall crossing, insider trading. So the regulations there are pretty cumbersome, and that is certainly an area where this notion of structured plus unstructured is really valuable. And finally, information security, the kinds of insider threats that Chris was touching on just a few moments ago. And Chris, I'll throw it over to you to walk through a little bit of the actual functions and features of the product.
Thank you. So at the high level dashboard within Red Owl, you can see the scenario analytics at their best. So what you have is a list of employees on the left, sorted by risk. And then by clicking into one of the employees, you are then presented with the charted risk score over time, broken down by scenarios or collections. You also have a cumulative risk score, but the ability to see the score by scenario is really powerful. Below that, we have our peer group analytics. So what is peer group analytics? Peer group analytics is the normalization of data based off of company attributes that apply to that user. So if you think about a network admin's user activity is probably very suspicious compared to a marketing employee. But compared to other network admins, his activity might not be suspicious at all. So we were able to normalize the data coming in for that network admin because we're also seeing similar trends amongst the network admin group. So the meat and potatoes of Red Owl, as I like to call it, is the Explore page. And it's really where the analysts can get their hands on the data and figure out the different types of incidents that they might be able to investigate. And that's what we have here. So towards the top left, you'll see the charted activity over time and broken down by data. And then below that, the top features that have been flagged on that data. So a feature, what is a feature? A feature is basically just a type of event. It can be a match against a lexicon set, so a match against confidential project words. It could be something more security related, so a non-approved user agent string. It can be sentiment, so negative sentiment detected within communications. A number of different things you can create with the feature types we have. On the right, you have the event viewer. So the cool thing about this is anywhere I click, the event viewer automatically snaps the events that apply to where I click. So if I click on the purple in the charted activity over time, that would give me the email, and I would have only email in the event viewer. The other thing you'll notice for each event is each event has two shades, the white, which is the top part, and the gray. The white has the entities listed for that event. So this goes back to the things that I'm tracking, the things I want to ask questions of risk for. So you can see for this web event, we have the app, the IP, the domain, the file. I can then ask risk for any of these. And for example, something like domain might not only apply to web, but it might apply to Windows as well. So I can then, kind of jump between different silos of data because of the information model. Below that, in between the two shades, you'll see the features in red. So these are the features that have been flagged on that specific event. And then moving down in the gray, these are the attributes, so the enhancements for that event. An example of this would be, I'm never going to ask risk of URL because there's millions or billions of URLs in your data repository. It's more so just an enhancement of the event. Same thing with method. So the model configuration page, this goes back to the different analytic models that you are able to create within Red Owl. At this page, you can create the model, select which features or types of events you want to be bundled into that model, and then decide how you want to ask the question. So two major pieces to this. The roles within the aggregation. This is where relationship analytics come into play. So for something like communications, the primary role is a sender, and the secondary is a recipient. And then you can see relationship analytics for you talking to a coworker, for any coworker actually. But let's say that one of your conversations is more violent than the other. That relationship would then flag higher on the workplace violence behavior model than others. Beyond that, you have the aggregation method. So the example I use for this is web uploads. So we can ask this question a couple of different ways. Do I care about the number of times you've uploaded something to the web? Do I care about the sum bytes you've uploaded to the web in a set time frame? Do I care about the max every time you've exceeded your max? Or do I care about every time you deviate from your normal baseline of your web uploads? And that's what you get with the aggregation method. So the models build the behavior. The features are the event, the models are the behavior. And then the models are bundled into scenarios, which is what you saw at the top level dashboard. So that three-tiered approach is going back to that, that our approach to the analytics instead of the classic signature approach. So we begin to talk about kind of the event structure within Red Owl. The event on the left, the structured event on the left is actually the example we were talking about. But looking at something like Windows, so the middle event in the top row, you can see looks very similar in similar fields. Let's ask a question, source IP. So the source IP can then jump between web or can jump between authentication and so on. So the ability to kind of slice and dice the data however you want with the information model is pretty powerful. But what about unstructured data? So unstructured data is potentially even more important than structured data, especially when you're trying to figure out what your employees are thinking, how they're feeling. And Red Owl also takes that into account. So within the events on the bottom row, you'll see there's the white shade with the entities, and then the gray with the attributes. And then below that, you'll have the content for the event. So something like a web search. We have our entities, where the web search occurred, the destination, the source, the attributes, and then the actual search itself. So this person was searching how to delete my bash history. The reason this is shoved into a content field, which is separate from the rest of the event, is I can then do one-off searches that apply to that content field. So I can search for just the word bash, and it would match on this event. And then this would apply to something like email and chat data as well. So the next event over, you'll see that the attachment within this print event is highlighted. So something pretty cool going on here. It's highlighted because I search for something that was in that document. Let's say that the financial properties document contained the word Mercury, and I did a one-off search again, as I said, for the word Mercury. It would apply to that document, even though the entities and the attributes did not match on anything from that word Mercury. So I can then dive into documents with these one-off searches pretty quickly, and then also have it return any other event types that don't necessarily have an attachment. And then the last event is how the email appears within Red Owl. So you can see it's all content for this. We treat communications as primarily content, whereas the structured data, you'll see the entities and whatnot. So the emails, we actually, I like to say that we take your email data and we make it appear as it would in your Outlook, which is pretty cool when you consider that a lot of insider threat analysts, they're not these, very well experienced security analysts. They're oftentimes, they have a behavioral side to it. It's a different type of person, as Mauricio said. So this stuff has to be understandable. It has to be digestible for these analysts. So reconstructing the email in a way that's easy to digest is really important.
Thanks a lot, Chris, for that overview. And I'd like to just conclude, and then we'll take some questions and answer those questions. But really, our goal today was to sort of frame out the insider threat as we have seen it in the market, working with our customers across government, financial services, the energy space, et cetera. And then provide some best practices and some recommendations, and then talk a little bit about how we deliver a solution that helps meet some of these requirements. And our solution is really meant to be that analytical platform. You still need all those other pieces in place. You got to have that team. You got to have those processes in place, and you have to start building a culture of compliance in your organization. So that it kind of to summarize here. insider threat and mitigating insider threat is, first of all, prioritization. Identifying and prioritizing the events and the insider activities that pose the greatest risk to your company. So that goes back to this notion of, what are your high value assets? What are your high risk populations? Secondly, it's about tying together these disparate events. So structured, unstructured data, you have to bring this all together. You've got to do some natural language processing, some sentiment-based analytics. You have to do behavioral analytics so you can start to build storylines within your company, right? You've got to build narratives that describe users' motivations, their attitudes, their moods, and the actions that they're taking as a result. And finally, this is really about a holistic visibility of the human risk factors and patterns within the organization. So, we touched on this. Chris just touched on this. It's a different discipline than your classic network security, techniques and approaches. This is really primarily focused about capturing that human risk. And so, with that, I'll throw it back over to Rob, and we'll take some questions.
Thanks very much, Mauricio and Chris. So we do have a couple of questions in the time we have remaining. First one, I guess let's give this to you, Mauricio. First one is, how do we handle false positives?
Yeah, false positives, we handle those a couple of ways. So when we have heard of false positives, one area in which you get false positives is in looking at communications data. And you might get an email that flags on some sentiment or some lexicon-based types of analytics, and then our customers will complain that the tools they have in place flag on every single reply and every single response. So the first thing that we focus on is classification of the events. So this is where you have advanced techniques, statistically driven techniques that we use to do things like classify both the type of event. So if you're looking at communications, classify, marketing, third-party emails, bulk messages from your actual internal human-to-human communications, right? So you start to bucket your events that way, and then you look inside the contents of those events, and you start to separate out parts, the internals of that communication. So is this a thread? Have we already analyzed the previous communications in this thread? If so, ignore that part of the event so that you're not generating duplicate alerts. Is this block of text a disclaimer? And if it is a disclaimer, then zone that out so that we're not flagging every event for confidential and proprietary hits. So those are some of the techniques that we use when we're looking at unstructured content and classification. And then just in general, behavioral analytics of both layering individual entity-based normalization and baselining. So what's normal for a person, and then layering that with peer group analytics. Is this behavior also normal amongst their peers or not? And when you kind of put those things together, what you see are interesting behaviors, and then it comes back to the human element, the analyst. Then it makes a judgment on whether that is malicious, whether it's negligent, or something else. Chris, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, that was well put.
Thanks.
Great. Next question is about privacy. How do you handle privacy, and how does privacy come up as an issue when it relates to monitoring for insiders?
Yeah, I mean, privacy is a top concern, as it should be. And so what you have to, and we'll tackle it from a technology perspective, because there's internal policy, and that's where you get legal and your privacy experts in play, and that's where we go back to getting alignment across the organization. What data sources are in play? What are if you're a multinational organization, what are your privacy regulations? How do they differ from one country to the next? So that's obviously the first part of it, is just setting that foundation. But then from a technology perspective, then you have to start to adopt or develop technologies that support all of those nuances when it comes to privacy. And from our perspective, we split it up into a couple of things. One is data entitlements. So perhaps an analyst might be entitled to see U.S. data, but not European data. or an analyst might be entitled to see data for, sales representatives, but not for the executive level group, or an analyst might be entitled to see network data, endpoint data, but not communications data. So this notion of entitlements, very granular entitlements that are flexible, is critical, and that's a big part of what we do. And you combine that with roles-based access to restrict what parts of the analytic platform customers have access to and what they can and can't do within the app. So it's certainly that's probably one of the most complex parts of of standing up a really good insider threat program. Good question.
Great. Okay, another question comes to us about integration. Can we discuss a little bit about whether we do bi-directional integration? Is it API driven or otherwise?
Sure. Chris, you want to tackle this one?
Sure. So we do bidirectional integration, and it really depends on the vendor. We do have a robust open API that allows outside solutions to query Red Owl and obtain statistical results that they can then feed into whatever analytics or solution that they're offering. On the other side, data coming in, we can then use that API, the same RESTful API, to pull data in that might be applicable to your insider threat mission. So really a number of different ways you can utilize the API. For example, something like ForcePoint, which is a pretty popular user activity monitoring software suite. We can pull the data in, and then we can also pump out alerts to ForcePoint, which can then be ingested by them.
Great. Another question was about, do we support any compliance standards, NISPOM being one example, but are there any compliance mandates that we work with that we currently support today?
Yeah, the majority of organizations that invest in Red Owl do so because they are mandated to do so by various compliance regulations. So yeah, that is where having this configurable analytics platform really comes into play, because every organization that we work with has a different set of policies around how they remain compliant with those regulations. And so we have to have flexibility. In terms of handling privacy, in terms of handling the analytics piece and the aggregation of the data. So really, it's the flexibility of the app. We don't have, say, a NISPOM module, for instance, but we do have a set of baseline analytics that are delivered that help organizations meet those requirements, meet SEC requirements around monitoring regulated traders, meet federal agency requirements around insider trade or around insider threat, et cetera. Chris, you're our resident NISPOM and government insider threat expert. What else do you have to add to that?
Nothing really. I thought you covered it pretty well.
Great.
Great. Next question we have was, what are some of the more common use cases that we see within our customer base as it relates to insider threats?
Yeah, common use cases. I'll kick it off and then see if Chris has anything else to add. But data exfiltration is a really big use case, and what we're seeing, especially is customers that have made investments in DLP are starting to discover that data exfil takes many forms and it occurs over many different channels. And to understand if a file movement is malicious or not, you need additional context. We often talk about DLP and data exfiltration. DLP being like TSA at the airport, right? You put your bag through a scanner, you walk through one of those scanners, and they don't really know anything about who you are, where you've been, what you've done. They just know if what you've got in your bag or what you've got on your person. we're finding that is a specific use case is really context rich DLP, right? What's the context that helps an analyst make a judgment as to whether a file movement is good or bad? IT sabotage, looking at privileged users is a really big use case, really important use case. And then, things like workplace violence, looking for sentiment and communications patterns inside the workplace to see if there are any, issues that you need to worry about there. And finally, leaver risk, folks who are leaving the organization, and that can be someone who's put in their resignation. It could be interns. We have customers that are worried about, when the interns' summer internship ends. Oftentimes, they don't know any better, and they think that the stuff they worked on would be really useful for a project that's coming up next semester. So they think it's okay to take that data with them. So those are a couple of use cases that I certainly see. Chris, is there anything else that you wanted to add to that?
So data exfil is a large one at the scenario level. On more of the micro level, as you said, Red Owl is very strong with our content analytics, so communications, web searches. That fuels stuff such as you also said, workplace violence. But beyond that, it's sexual harassment, it's security clearance risk, it's IT oversight evasion, so like proxy avoidance and whatnot. So really a lot of good use cases that can be derived from content analytics, or say it's the most common that I've seen involving communications data.
Yeah, and sorry, I left out, but should not have, insider trading when it comes to regulatory surveillance, financial services. It's looking at regulated traders. Are they trading on material non-public information? So that in that case, you're looking at trading activity. You're coupling that with chat activity. In these trader Bloomberg chat rooms, you're looking at email activity. So insider trading is a massive use case for us as well.
Great. We have time for one more question. So the question is around sentiment analysis and what sort of added analytic uplift do you get from sentiment analysis? So the question also asks, if you're just relying on metadata, for example, what are the types of things that you're going to miss, and how does that mess up the search for insider threats?
Sentiment is a big part of it, and so if you're just looking at metadata, it's two things: sentiment and content. If you can't see the content of a web upload of a print job, then it's very difficult to determine the value of that asset that has just been moved to from digital to physical form, or from internal to an external source. Secondly is sentiment. And sentiment helps us make better judgments around whether somebody has a motivation to take some sort of action.
Great. And with that, we are done with our webinar. I want to thank everybody for dialing in today, and hopefully you got a lot out of our webinar. And thanks to Mauricio and Chris for spending the time today and sharing their best practices and their experiences. With that, everybody have a good rest of your day.